Okay, maybe we can start, and let me welcome all of you. Maybe I will just pass the floor very quickly to Giancarlo Dente for some technical indications or guidelines.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Just some technical information. As you know, the webinar is delivered through the Zoom platform. So you can ask your questions by using the chat box, which is at the very bottom of your screen. You can also raise your hand when opening the discussion. And in any case, we would kindly ask all the participants to turn on their screen if they can, so that we can, let's say, see the participants and have, let's say, an interactive discussion with all of you. And thanks.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for joining this very important webinar today on how to create and use evidence for youth and gender inclusive labor markets. We know that the situation of young people and women across countries is really challenging. They are disproportionately excluded from the labor market, and if they have jobs, often these are poor quality jobs with limited social security and limited learning opportunities. Often they work in the informal economy with high peaks in developing countries. We know, for instance, from ILO Transition Survey that up to 95% of young people work in informal economy in Palestine, but many other countries in the region score 8 or 9 out of 10 young people in the informal economy. Yesterday, I was reading about some very worrisome estimates by the UN Women that say that it would take us around 300 years to reach gender equality at the current rate of progress. The struggle for gender equality is a struggle for women everywhere in the world. SDG 5 is off track. That means that the 2030 agenda is off track. And as researchers and policymakers, our work on gender-related issues is the refusal of this fact. I'm happy to see all of you here today because inclusion of young people in the labor market and women in the labor market is not only an issue of social justice, it's also an issue linked to the socio-economic development of countries and fruitful use of human capital. After all, we are talking about human rights. In the European Union and in Europe, we recognize the importance of the development, well-being and participation in society and in the labor market of young people and women. And we try to do that by investing in their potential, supporting their labor market integration, promoting quality jobs, facilitating skills development and mobility, and fighting economic and social exclusion. There are some structural megatrends, such as digitalization, greening, demographic change, that accelerate labor market change. And we also see that there are ongoing crises, and I refer to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also to the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis that caused a lot of disruption and uncertainty. From the 2008 financial crisis to the pandemic, we know that young people and women are more vulnerable to economic crisis, and they are also the first ones that lose their job. And this is due to a number of different reasons. For instance, the fact that they hold less secure contracts or jobs with a negative impact also on their mental well-being. And we will hear more about this in the course of the day. There are labor shortages across Europe and beyond its borders in sectors that are critical for the twin transition, green and digital, and they are aggravating. Employers need new people to fill new positions in green and digital jobs. And many young people and many girls and women are motivated to contribute to the change and have the skills and also the capacity that are needed for this future of work, which is no longer distant, but it's a reality already now. And also on this, we will hear our colleagues later on. But the problem for young people and for women is also often accessing the opportunities. On the road to recovery and resilience, we need to address these difficulties to make opportunities more visible and enable young people and women to build a better future, which is greener, fairer, and also more digital. Young people and women are very high in the political agenda of countries where ETF works, countries that surround the European Union, and especially after the 2011 Arab Spring, regardless of their very different socio-economic condition and different stage of demographic transition. There are a lot of challenges, and the very high needs rate is a simple but very clear indicator of all those young people who are outside of employment or education or training. And let's remember that the large majority of these needs are young girls. But there are also opportunities. As I mentioned before, the green and digital transition offer future-oriented jobs for the young generation and for women. The global economy and labor market is undergoing substantial transformation, and in the many studies that we have conducted, we have seen that there are new jobs emerging, old jobs disappearing, but also all jobs changing with new tasks. And young people and women can grasp the opportunities if they have the right skills to pick up on those jobs. And making sound decisions about education and training and careers critically relies on the information and insights into these opportunities, which means that skills intelligence helps a lot young people and women, but also employers and policymakers to understand skills needs, not only the skills that are needed today, but the skills that will be needed in a longer term perspective. And of course, also skills intelligence becomes smarter. We use online job vacancies to detect the new emerging skills. And we also work much more with skills foresight to help making sense of long-term trends in an uncertain world. Overall, despite the extremely challenging situation of young people and women in the country, supporting them to find their place in the society with a special eye for those who are excluded and have fewer opportunities become really essential to support countries in their path toward development and growth. And youth and women can be the real opportunity for the countries to catch up with the more advanced economies. Now, I think we all agree on that, on the need to integrate young people and women more in the society and in the labor market, but how to do that? How to ensure that the findings are translated into real action that reduce the 300-year gap that I mentioned at the beginning. I think that the research community has a real importance to work on this topic, not only to generate the knowledge, but also in advocating for specific actions. And skills are a very important element for catching up. Effective education system can be a very powerful tool to support young people and women success in the labor market, including their transition to the formal economy. However, skills are not a panacea, and there are many other measures that need to be taken to ensure that young people and women can fairly transit to the labor market. And the resetting effect of the pandemic can present an opportunity to accelerate the transition to new development models that are based on a socioeconomic and ecological transformation that puts individuals, but particularly young people and women, at the heart of the policy agendas. And we will talk about these today with a number of presentations from the ETF and from other colleagues from the research community, which will present some innovative methods, some innovative findings, but we will also use the opportunity to reflect together to discuss how these findings, as I mentioned before, can be translated into real policy actions. So I will conclude here, but I want to give the floor immediately to my colleagues for the very important research and studies that have been conducted and to share with us the preliminary results. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesca. Hello, everyone. My name is Baket Omurzakov, and I'm happy to be here today to moderate first session. The first session is about a discussion and presenting some very recent evidence gained through some researches. And I'm happy to present three interesting ladies with their interesting presentations. First presentation will be about survey that was jointly conducted by ETF and Eurofound that documented the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the lives and working and learning of young people and women. Second presentation will be about the evidence on the impact of digitalization on youth and women's employment, as well as policy implications of new working and learning patterns. Just wanted to remind that if you have some questions, please use our chat box, and we will be giving you some floor for this opportunity to ask your questions. So first presentation, I'm giving the floor to Outi Kerkäinen and Kristiina Meriussa. Please, ladies, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you. I just want to check if you can see the presentation. Is it okay?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So together with my colleague Outi, who leads the gender-related activities of the ETF, we will quickly share the methodological aspects and also some key findings and policy messages that came out from this research we have implemented last year, and we will continue also this year, together with our sister agency, Eurofound. The research looked at the living, working, and also some elements of education and training in all EU, 27 member states, and in 10 EU neighboring countries. We will zoom in now only on some findings and implications related to poverty, to social conditions, but also the feedback of young people and women when it comes to labor market learning and let's say social experiences. But I would invite you to have a look, because it's a wealth of information there. Just to provide a quick background information, Eurofound has started this type of research in 2020 when the pandemic, let's say, kicked all of us. The reason was the impossibility, the incapacity of statistical offices or other research organizations to run typical surveys that would have implied direct contact with the respondents and so on. So for the first time, at least in the case of Eurofound, they used this method of e-survey on a large scale, and they tried to improve it to make sure that the results are representative and there are no biases in the results. So far, Eurofound has, I think, implemented already 5 rounds. And last year in 2022, in April, May, we also joined them and we tested the e-survey in 10 partner countries. You have there the links to the results. I also want to point out for you, because I guess most of the colleagues that are with us are researchers, data analysts, and so on. On Eurofound, you can also access, you have direct access to microdata, to the data, raw data sets that came out from this survey. So it's a wealth of information for your further research that you could run. So for us, it was why we started this initiative was also to test this innovative methodology and to make sure that the data we collect are to the extent possible comparable to the EU 27 data sets. We wanted also to add few additional elements when we discuss. I mean, ETF is very much, focused on skills development, on school to work transition, labor market policies, and so on. But all of us, we know that this doesn't have this kind of, policy goals or objectives and so on do not happen in a kind of vacuum. Elements of poverty, of well-being are extremely important, and often they act as a kind of barrier to employment or access to skill development programs and so on. Another reason, of course, an e-survey helps researchers and policymakers to get data faster. Yeah, so it's almost a real-time collection and processing of data. Some additional elements, methodological elements. The target population was 18 plus. We used Facebook as a social media campaign as a modality to outreach respondents. We made sure, together with Eurofound, that we have a very clear socio-demographic targeting strategy to make sure that we have an even, let's say, representative coverage of different target population groups. We sampled by age, by gender, by education level in each country. It was quite successful. We got over 18,000 responses from 10 countries, and I'm talking here about people that filled in completely the questionnaire, which is quite it's quite complex. We tried to keep the questionnaire in terms of time to fill in it below 20 minutes. Of course, it was available in all countries, the languages. That was also a bit difficult because we also had to test it against, the words, the translation, and so on. So that the significance of meaning of different words, that was kind of, bit challenging. The topics included in the survey are working conditions, including teleworking patterns. That was very, very important in the context of pandemic and post-pandemic. Social conditions like issues of housing, for example, including access to internet, poverty, work-life balance and well-being, education and skills development. Using social media, for those of you who already tested, brings a lot of advantages, but also there are a lot of traps. Let's call it like that. So often women tend to be more engaged and provide more answers. Middle-aged and older people, and also tertiary educated. But we weighted the results, and we managed to assure a representative, let's say, representative results. I want here just to underline few, let's say, elements that are most not shocking. I mean, they are very alarming. Yeah, we knew about these elements of high poverty, high exclusion in the EU neighboring countries, but for the first time, we have these indicators that key, for policymakers, but also for any analysis in this field, like people that are afraid of losing job, people that feel that they are faced with job insecurity, but most importantly, the financial fragility. And here you have comparison EU versus EU 27 versus EU neighboring countries, but you'll see also that for certain indicators, the situation is alarming in both, let's say, both geographical context. Another, I don't know why it doesn't work. I try to move slides, okay. Another important element and message is that many, absolutely, like we have like over 80% in our EU neighboring countries, many people are not able to making ends meet, so they have huge issues when it comes to paying their bills and afford to have a good quality life.
Martin Schöre.
Sorry. Okay, and you also see here that, for example, the households with children are more exposed to such risk. Another element I would like to underline is also the housing insecurity, because all of us, we were faced and forced to work more from home, to learn from home, and so on. And also when it comes to employment or access to education and training, good quality or even decent quality of housing is a must. And maybe this is the point where I want to underline the, let's say, a big advantage for us of having this e-survey. We managed to outreach people, displaced people in Lebanon, for example, or in Jordan, who are living in tents. So this housing insecurity is also reflected, or let's say it's higher perceived insecurity might come also from the, let's say, the group, the populations that we managed to cover with this survey, particularly the displaced people, people are migrants and so on. When it comes to young people, we noticed a high rate share of young people that feel that they are being excluded from the society. This, of course, comes from the lower levels of life satisfactions, and that lead also to a perceived higher risk of depression. I would give the floor now to Oti, my colleague, who will take over on the gender side.
Thank you, Christina. Good morning to everybody. Happy to be here with you this morning. You can probably still stay on the previous slide, Christina. Sorry, I'm just... Well, just to say that, how to start? We know that the activity rates of women are lower in the EU and EU neighborhood and globally, and that the unemployment rates of women and youth are higher also everywhere. It was probably not the case in all the Eastern Partnership countries, but recently we have seen also a step back in Eastern Partnership regarding the women's unemployment. So we tend to look at these indicators, but however, looking only at them doesn't give us the whole picture. It doesn't really help us understanding what are the underlying causes behind these inequalities in the labor market, and to promote equal opportunities on the labor market in a more, let's say, transformative and permanent way. So this survey, like Christina just mentioned, provided us an excellent opportunity to go beyond these indicators and look what is behind, why these indicators, official statistics, are what they are today for women and youth. And it was also a first time that we could collect this kind of new evidence in the ETF partner countries. So I will show you just a couple of findings beyond these official statistics that we could dig out with the survey as a food for thought for further discussion then during the webinar. We looked, for example, at the workload. So if you look at the weekly working hours, both in neighborhood countries and EU 27, women work a couple of hours less per week than men. This is a global trend overall in the world. It's the same thing. It was worsened by COVID-19. We say that now the employment of women has recovered to the same extent than the employment of men after COVID. However, ILO estimates that we still see a big difference in low and middle income countries regarding the working hours for female. But then if you add to this average working hours per week, the unpaid work in household, from gardening to taking care of children, it adds up to a total working hours, which results in the neighborhood countries to 35 hours more work for women and 16 hours in the EU. So if we go further and look what this means in terms of work-life balance, we see that it's, let's say, if we look at the well-being indicators, some of them, we have several one in the survey. Here, just two of them. We see that it's, let's say, that it's much worse for women, and especially in the neighborhood. The first indicator being feeling tired after work to do the household work. Now, if you look at the second one, which is worrying about work, even when you're not working, it's actually slightly worse for men, which could, we suppose, result from the fact that in the EU neighborhood, the situation is what it is, what Christina just told us about the financial difficulties, making the ends meet until the end of the month, and the fact that men are still more often the single income provider in a household. Then we looked also at teleworking. This is interesting. It's a way of, it's a way of flexible working and a coping mechanism also. What we see that, first of all, if you look at the first graphic on the left, I think it's left upper hand side also for you, we see that both men and women do more telework in the EU than in the EU neighboring countries. We also see that women telework more than men, both in the neighboring countries and the EU 27. In the second graphic, you see that when women telework, so we looked at only those men and women who either worked only from home or combined, the proportion of teleworking out of the total working hours is always higher for women. Again, something that was true in 95% of the countries surveyed, both in the ETF countries and let's say EU neighboring countries and EU 27. But then when we look at the, let's say the, how would I say it? The underlying objective of using teleworking or using, I said that, how is it used to cope with the work-life balance? We see actually a gender difference. So both in the EU 27 and the neighborhood countries that were surveyed, men that do not have children use teleworking more than men that have children. And the contrary is true for women. Then the last point I wanted to show you, just once again, like I said, as a food for thought, is related to the lifelong learning. If you look at the job-related training by sex, okay, we knew already that in the EU, well, it's more or less the same for women and men. There are differences in between the countries, but we're not going to go into details here. But what we found out through the survey that women in the EU neighborhood countries are more active in job-related training. The question was whether you had some job-related training during the last 12 months. So we went further and looked also at the non-job-related training to see, whether it was training to knit and do some, hobbies and so on. But if you look at the list, which includes both the job-related and not job-related training, it's still higher for women, but the proportion of the difference related to only job-related training is less between the sexes. So what we can see is that women really take advantage of job-related training, which could also mean active labor market measures. And this gives us some hope also to work in the neighborhood and our partner countries, And whether we do it in this survey or the next round, we want, and I think we should, to look at this, this use of education and training possibilities, which also can mean active labor market measures, not only by sex, but also by education level, the labor market status, rural and urban division, to provide some evidence for policy advice, to make to help countries to develop some effective employment policies, including active labor market measures, and to promote gender equality on the labor market in a more transformative way. So looking also at the causes behind what we see. At this point, I give floor back to you, Christina.
Okay, and I conclude quickly because we are running out of time. So I think the first message from our side is that definitely this is an innovative and affordable solution to get insights like the one OT just mentioned. But they complement what countries are already doing. So we do not want to replace or use just one source or another. This is maybe a main message that ETF gives when it comes to skills needs assessment or other types of research, that we need to combine different sources and so on. But this study allowed us to shed light on issues that were not well or not even studied in the neighboring countries. In terms of policy messages, definitely what we want to share is that measures to improve the childcare facilities, access to quality health services, but also mental care. And this is an element that we take already in consideration when it comes to career guidance and other type of support to young people, in the post-pandemic, but also in the context of conflicts and war and so on, particularly for the displaced people. Another one, OT mentioned already, this gender responsive, active and well-targeted skills development, employment support, particularly also for young people. I think this type of research also helps policymakers to target better, maybe, as Oti mentioned, the urbanization factor is important. How much training, support for training is available in the rural and remote areas, for example. And finally, I think, and this is something that is a priority also for our work, this embracing of digital age, digital skills development, even greening, this type of goals require an in-depth reform of the working arrangements, of the regulations, access to digital infrastructure for all, and upskilling and reskilling pathways. Thank you. We stop here and we give the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, lady. Thank you very much. We have some questions and we will be asking them, I think, after the second presentation, according to the schedule. Second presentation is about the evidence on the impact of digitalization on youth and women's employment and policy implication of new working and learning patterns. And I'm happy to give the floor to Ivona Genko. Ivona, floor is yours. Please welcome Ivona. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm just playing a little bit with my digital skills because I had some issues with screen sharing. Just wanted to check whether you can see the screen in the right way.
Yes.
Excellent. So it means that I'm progressing and in a very fast track. So just as a continuation of the first presentation of Christina and Outi, we had really this very strong reflection on the new trends that are impacting working and learning when it comes to youth and women in particular, but also when it comes to the groups that are underrepresented on the labor market. We were thinking about migrants, minorities, people that are in rural areas. And then we thought that, okay, so we have this wonderful digital transition that actually can enable access to those people to labor market and give them better opportunities in the future. With this, we looked at what is happening at the EU level and also in the EU neighboring countries from different perspectives.
Ivona, we are still on the first.
Yes, and here it seems that my digital skills did not progress so fast, or my internet connection is not. Yes, it's not as good. So when we look what current trends would mean for the future of work, particularly for young people and women, of course, we wanted to analyze the gender dimension in education and labor market, because we are talking all about youth and also young women, and about transition from school to work. So we wanted to see how the changing work environment that is triggered by digitalization is implying also some elements on the labor market, and what it means also for skills development policies. With this, of course, we wanted to see how ETF can support the definition of the youth and gender sensitive or youth and gender responsive policies, and then those that are already being implemented, how we can consolidate their effectiveness, and then, of course, to look from the perspective of services, how we can support in a more holistic and comprehensive way. What we see in the general scope of the issues related to our neighboring countries of the EU, sorry, just jumping, that we see a huge diversity of and different contexts that are also not only linked just about economic perspective, but really very strongly to geopolitics. We are now experiencing conflicts that we wouldn't think some time ago, actually even a year ago, because tomorrow we will have 1 year from the Russian aggression in Ukraine. So what we see that also not only the pandemic, but also other trends, not only the trends that we are thinking about, digitalization and greening of the economies, are impacting the labor markets and the situation, particularly social situation of people in the countries. Then what we already observed, that despite the huge potential that we are having in the EU neighboring countries, unfortunately, they still, from the economic perspective, suffer from very low productivity and inefficient use of resources. This is in general terms, but especially of human resources. And as we were saying before, and Christina and Outi underlined the huge impact of pandemic. Also Francesca mentioned that on one hand, it has been a huge challenge, and we are still experiencing consequences and challenges of the pandemic, but it could also be a great opportunity, and particularly for the ICT sector and digital transition, because we are observing actually a huge increase in value added of ICT sector, in particular between 2020 and 2022. So this is exactly when we had the impact of the pandemic. And with this, we already see that industrial relations are changing, and I'm very sorry because my slides are jumping, I think. It's something that it's more maybe temporalized here, but I will try to just go very quickly to say that the industrial relations are changing. So then also the type of jobs are also changing. So we really shift from industrialization that we are observing still in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and beginning of 90s towards more services and service-oriented economies, also in EU neighboring countries. And we now already observing a part of digitalization, also a huge trend of greening of the economies. So there is a policy reflection on that that will also impact the types of jobs that will be available on the labor market. But with this, as already also mentioned by Outi and Christina, unfortunately, we are also observing a huge volatility and really huge risks of social inclusion, but also in terms of working conditions. So the working type is changing, and also the type of jobs that are available on the market is also changing. And this is also happening because of the type of business relations, huge outsourcing that we are observing in EU neighboring countries. Also, emergence of new types of businesses and technological parks that are, of course, linked with technology transfers from more developed countries. But also another trend that we were investigating and we were discussing more in detail in November, growing number of workers from EU neighboring countries on international platforms. And here mostly young people are involved in these new types of jobs. And unfortunately, or fortunately, most are educated. This is what we already investigated in our research, but also coming from urban areas. So our argument that digitalization would help integration and would help social inclusion as well of those that are more vulnerable on the labor market is actually not happening, because we are observing a very strong gender segmentation and a huge gender gap also in those new types of occupations, which actually are favoring men. And here I need to underline it because this is something that we were observing very strongly in terms also of skills availability, but not only, but also a simple perception that men and young men can do certain types of jobs better. So with this, we actually, what we saw when we were looking at patterns of workers, for example, on labor online platforms, is that women do not disclose very often that they are women. So we could not track very well gender dimension. This is a very interesting finding, I need to say. Simply because they were treated in a less favorable way, also in terms of offer of working conditions, like, for example, pay. So it was much better to hide under the nickname. And in the digital world, you can actually do that. So we still have, let's say, a kind of positive feedback for the future, that if you can hide your gender, on the other hand, you can actually perform quite well. But let me also discuss really very quickly the issue of evidence, because this is the major topic of our webinar. What we observe in terms of digitalization is actually a lack of evidence. It's a very difficult to capture certain trends because simply they are not visible in traditional statistics. And this is why I also believe that the survey that we conducted with Eurofund that has just been presented gives a new and innovative method that can capture certain elements statistics and traditional data collection. I made two columns for looking at possible ways of investigating gender and youth dimension on the labor market and access to employment. The left-hand side is more traditional, I would say, so with, of course, desk research and traditional methods of data collection from labor force survey, for example, interviews or representative surveys, and also focus group discussions. What we already know is that also this traditional means of data collection, apart of not capturing certain elements, they are also very costly. So then I would really seek for those innovative methods, including also big data analytics that we also used. And you can see marked in red the elements of information collection and data collection that we used in our analysis, for example. And we used big data analytics as well. That is actually, once we have an algorithm and a program that is scraping web pages, the data flow is constant, it can be periodic, and it is really very cost effective. And the text mining is the same. Once we have a program, then we can also train the program, and then we can gather and we can have this continuous data flow. And alternative surveys, e-survey mentioned by Outi and mentioned and explained by Outi and Christina through social media. We tested already in 2018 in the first round. It was not a representative survey, but now we have also a more thorough technique that we could seek representatives of this type of surveys. But also we were looking at online panel surveys and on omnibus surveys that could be also an alternative way of data collection. One of the issues that actually I put as an example, because there are a lot of developments in terms of data collection methods. For example, the part of online labor platforms that we discussed in November, actually the proposal for an EU directive on improving working conditions of platform workers already seeks for improving data collection by obliging business actors like labor platforms to report on the workers that they are mediating their employment through platforms. And those are the really very interesting developments that could help evidence collection and then could inform policy making. Here I prepared for you that something that I really found very interesting, a comparison that has been done by OECD. To be honest, I recognize it. But I found also a very interesting, it as a very interesting comparison for my reflection, I need to say, about advantages and disadvantages of some of the techniques for evidence collection. Of course, we will share the slides afterwards, and I will not go very much into details. But what I really wanted to underline, and I already said, we also need to think about how we can capture certain trends that are not visible, maybe in the those that are listed in the first part, like more traditional ways, moving more towards those alternative ways linked to big data, web scraping, e-surveys, and other methods. But still my reflection would be that one is never enough. So we always need to complement evidence collection, really triangulate from different perspectives, and we've really combined different methods of data collection, even in one research. But with this, just very, very briefly, because that was already discussed by Outi and Christina, is that we capture the same elements like volatility, labor market segmentation that we are now seeing very prominently in terms of gender and youth dimensions. We also see that regulations do not follow the new work patterns. And they also do not follow because social partners are not present in the digital world and in the digital work. So they are also not triggering some of the policy measures. So we cannot also wait just for the policymakers that they would capture all of the elements. I think that the research community has also this task to support evidence collection towards pushing for policy changes. But
I deeply apologize for interrupting everyone.
Yes.
We are time.
Yes, I'm finishing now. Thank you. But still, what we were saying, but Outi underlined that while, for example, young people and women are more prone for career development, for learning, sometimes they do not find time while working. So we were thinking more, this is just to show you the difference in gender and youth dimension, different ways of policies deliveries. If you want to change the situation and close the gaps that we are experiencing. And this is just to show you in colors, for example, on labor platforms, the difference between that you have in blue of men participating in employment on labor platforms, and in green are women. Still, as I said, some of gender dimension is still uncovered. But for the policy dimensions, then of course, and that was also mentioned already, digitalization and technology that is also impacting some changes in work organization, but on the other hand gives much more opportunities. And what we need to think now is how to capture those opportunities. But also from the labor market perspective, what we already see that new types of jobs are bringing also new working patterns that unfortunately they are linked with informality and less job security and unfortunately inferior working conditions. That of course it impacts education and training, that this is our perspective on skills, because it impacts career and career progression and employment development and career development, skills development. And this is why we again came to the conclusion that evidence is crucial to push for the policy making. And we are committed also to explore new ways to collect the evidence for informing policy makers and for discussion and launching policy dialogue to really make a contribution to close gender and gaps and really facilitate transition of young people to labor market. And I think with this, I would like to thank you very much. And I hope that we can have a nice discussion triggered also by the findings of our work. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Ivona. Colleagues, we are just have just a couple of questions to wrap up this session. For those of you colleagues that are interested in presentation, the all presentation will be shared with you. Indeed. First question for Oiti and Christina. Nina from Georgia was asking, let me just quote this question. This is only tendency, right? The difference in majority of cases is so small, it should not be statistically significant. It was about involvement of women and men in training and so on.
Yeah, if it's about participation of women and men, there are slight differences, but I think that's the point of the survey, to show that in certain cases and in certain geographical areas, participation in education and training is rather more or less similar. But I think the point we want to make, and I think it's in the fact sheet as well in the publication, is that although women tend to have, to participate in education training, they often have higher education attainment overall. Their presence in the labor market, in the employment and wage, particularly when it comes to salaries and so on, is lower, compared if we compare to men. So I hope I clarified this, and allow me, because we are very, very late with the time. So, okay, Bakit, so let's see what are the next questions.
Yeah, the second question, just very quickly.
May I just add?
Yes, please.
Yeah, may I just add that for the job-related training, the difference in the EU neighborhood is about 30%. So I don't think it's a non-significant difference between men and women in the representative survey. Thank you.
I see. Thank you. Second question is from Radion from Ukraine. I have a question probably to Christina and Oiti. Have all these trends and implications related to digitalization and platform work do or did affect the interest on young people for formal employment? At the beginning of the meeting, Francesca said that there is a sign of informal employment rate growing, but is this a problem for modern young workers? Based on your research, I guess.
Quickly from my side, but then I think Ivona would like to say a few words on that as well. I mean, digitalization forced us to reinvent actually and rethink the labor regulations, the way we define services and so on, and to push for more studies when it comes to individuals' preferences, expectations, and so on. The results of the platform work studies are already shedding some light on these issues, but definitely additional investigations, interviews, panel discussions with young people are necessary. Of course, the straightforward answer would be yes, maybe even in a traditional previous labor markets, maybe young people were not very, concerned about an episode of working in informal contexts. Sometimes they were forced, often, yeah, because these were, it's a barrier and it's a difficulty when young people enter the labor market. But on the other side, sometimes it's a preference because in our countries, as you well known, Rodion, in Eastern Partnership countries, in Southeast Europe, everywhere, there is a very, very high and unfriendly labor taxation, yeah? That's something that leads to this. So that's why maybe in terms of policy messages and how the policy should look like, we also argue for changing the eligibility criteria when it comes to access to active labor market policies, skills development, and so on. So to encompass also all these vulnerable, underemployed people. But overall, when it comes to attitudes of young people, I think we need more studies. Yeah, Ivona, maybe you would like to add on that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, this is a very, very relevant question, and Christina very nicely explained the issue. I would say just from our research that unfortunately, even digitalization is bringing more informality, also because of legal frameworks that are really not adapted to new types of jobs, new working patterns, also working for the multiple employers, and certain even informality cannot be captured. And there is a second issue, I would say. What would be an incentive for a young person really to work formally and pay taxes when then there is no perspective of getting a pension in an older age, or services are not as a young person would have? So those are really elements that are touching upon many policy areas, but very much also the legislative frameworks in the countries. And I think that it's such a fascinating topic that we could have another webinar to discuss the issues of informality and young people. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you. One last question with regard to Ivona, your presentation from Rodion, from Ukraine. The question is, this issue on hiding gender, has you discovered any correlation between rising employment perspectives and gender? Do women who do not hide gender while searching job less get a job comparing to non-gender identified job seekers? Is question clear?
Thank
Bakit,
you.
thank you, Ivona. I guess I got the answer on one of your last slides when you were presenting this diagram with male, female, and non-identified data. So I think we can skip this question just to save a bit time for the further discussion.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rodion. Well, colleagues, if there are no more questions, I'm giving floor back to Francesco. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I look at our colleagues and Giancarlo. Do we want to give a few minutes break? We are a little bit late, but maybe a couple of minutes to allow people to just have a short walk or a coffee.
Yeah, I mean, it's 11:05. Maybe shall we reconvene in 5 minutes? If it's fine, everyone. Okay, so we'll be back in 5 minutes and we'll go ahead.
Thanks a lot to colleagues for the excellent presentations. Very insightful. Thank you.
Colleagues.
Hi again, everybody. My name is Najib Hamouti, and I'm a member of ETF Skills Labs Network for the region, or CVED. I'm happy to welcome today two speakers, Vladimir Lasny and Mircea Badeshko. So the first intervention is about research that has been written by Shireen Al-Azzawi and Vladimir Lasny, and it's about youth labor market vulnerabilities, evidence from Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia. Those of us who have lived or traveled or been to North Africa and some countries in the Middle East should see vulnerability, that it is something which is visible. You can see some young people doing some informal jobs like selling things on the pavement, or a vigilant, or holding something for someone to get paid some pennies. So the article itself, Youth Labor Market Vulnerabilities, is going to discuss some of the findings about vulnerability in Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia. I welcome Vladimir to start his presentation, and he has 20 minutes time. Okay, Vladimir, the floor is yours. And I invite our colleagues present here to ask their questions on the chat. No question will be left aside. You shall take note of every question and ask the panelists by the end of their intervention. Thank you very much.
Here you go. Thank you, Najib, for the kind introduction. Thank you for hosting our a presentation. So as Najib said, this is a joint work, ongoing work with an Egyptian scholar at Santa Clara University in California, Shireen Al-Azzawi. We have worked on tracking the fortunes of workers, especially youth workers, in whatever available countries in the MENA region we have been able to over the past several years. The presentation today is on the situation in the 2010s, so before Corona. One big challenge in the region is the lack of good systematic data across countries, across population groups, and across over time. So here we've limited ourselves to 3 countries in the region, and which have some kind of comparable, harmonized data sets in panel form, so that we can track the dynamics of labor market outcomes of these workers. In follow-up work, we also looked at the employment outcomes during COVID using some high-frequency phone surveys in something like 5 MENA countries. I will not talk about this ongoing project, but when I share the slides with ETF, I will put links to those studies in case there is interest. Okay, so as we heard in previous presentations, and as Najib mentioned, we see a lot of employment problems and informality in the region. I'm not sure if I can transition. Let's see. Here we go. So the first slide is kind of giving a little bit of stylized evidence on the fortunes of young people in the region. It comes from The Economist, from a couple of, I think 2018, showing that the notorious youth bulge in the region. You can see that most MENA countries are to the right of the dashed red line, which is the world average, and most of the region is above the horizontal dashed red line, a world average in terms of youth unemployment. So much of the region has a problem with youth unemployment, and it's in quantitative terms, it's a large problem. because a large share of the population and a large number of bodies in terms of millions of youth are affected. And when we look at the different demographic groups, youth female, youth male, adult female, adult male, across all these population groups, the Arab states and the Northern Africa stand out, especially when it comes to adult females and youth males. So the region is really an outlier in the global perspective in terms of employment outcomes of, we can say, marginalized groups. Here we go. So again, we could say that the youth unemployment is as high as 40% of men and over 60% of women in some countries in the region. Over 85% of youth in the region are in informal employment. And when we look specifically at the NEET group, again, we see a large, we see that the region is a clear outlier from the global perspective. And so in this, but in this study, we don't want to look at just statically what is the static employment status of fresh graduates, and kind of what is the initial start in the job market from graduates. But we also look a little bit at we try to get started on this discussion of what is the career path of these disadvantaged workers. So so we look at least 2 points in time where the workers started in their youth, straight from education, and where they ended up something like 6 years later. And these nationally representative panel surveys from the 3 countries help us do this tracking carefully. Okay, just one footnote here is that, well, unfortunately, for a while, these surveys we're using here are it. The next waves of these labor market panel surveys have been postponed due to COVID, due to funding issues. So there are these crises in the region with economic situation and with well, these multiple crises that make any political reasons why it's very difficult to get new survey data. So we don't expect for the next 2-3 years to have any more micro evidence on the employment status of workers. Okay, but we're doing what we can with the micro data we have. And we chop up the employment outcomes into careful pieces. So we try to distinguish formal, informal, irregular employment status. We also look separately at unemployed and the out of the labor force. Among informal workers, I will not be showing this here, but we also look at informal workers in the private sector who work within establishments and who work outside of establishments. And so we do different cuts to get a sense of who are the most disadvantaged workers and what kind of transitions, these very granular, careful transitions we see. Okay. And the central question is, I think, beyond how do youth workers start in their careers and in the labor market, but what kind of transitions can they, whatever their initial status is, can they move up in the following something like 6 years to decent employment? And that's where our central results are. That actually, even beyond the poor starting conditions, it's that workers, or many workers, are kind of stunted in their employment and their career growth opportunities. So here I show the central results for Egypt. Let me just quickly check. Okay, and let's focus on the right side of the graph, where I show the most recent survey data. It shows on the horizontal axis, it shows the year 2012 employment status of workers who were youth at that time. So these workers graduated right before 2012. This was their initial employment status. And the question is, on the vertical axis, where they landed 6 years later. And what we see is a lot of stagnation. So if you started in a formal private or formal public sector right in the middle of the graph, you are very likely, this red box kind of indicates roughly how likely you are to remain formal private or public worker 6 years later. Very likely that you keep that job. If you started in an irregular or informal position, you are very likely to remain irregular or informal, and you have a very low chance, something like 10%, 15, not more than 20% chance of transitioning to formal employment 6 years later. If you started as being unemployed, you took your time to accept the first job, or if you remained out of the labor force in a while, we can also see that your chances of transitioning to formal employment 6 years later in 2018 are quite low. And one thing, now that we see these descriptive statistics, we can even kind of speculate. So if you were a youth male worker in 2012, how should you play the conditions in the labor market? Should you keep looking for jobs? Should you accept the first available irregular gig and try to transition from that? And kind of paradoxically, kind of the bad news is that this evidence suggests, I think I have a fire alarm in my background, but hopefully it's false and it will not affect our presentation. It seems that the best strategies for youth male workers would have been to remain unemployed, keep searching, don't go for the first poor quality job, because it would affect your prospects down the line. Okay, so paradoxically, the recommendation would be not to try to increase your work experience in irregular or informal work, but stay out until a decent job comes around. Okay, we see the same thing for Jordan and Tunisia. And if we look, instead of a static review of employment statuses when we're youth and 6 years later, if we run a multinomial probabilistic regression of workers' employment status, just so that we can estimate the determinants or drivers of workers' employment status and how these employment statuses evolve over time. The graphs on this slide show your employment status at different ages and the probability of landing in a particular employment status at each point in time. So we can in the complete left, we see the employment status of men between 2008, 2012, 2018. Then we see the same thing for women, and we see big differences between employment statuses of men and women. So for men, the most critical risk is of being informally or irregularly employed, while for women it's always, regardless of your point in time, remaining out of the labor force. We can also compare Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia, and we see some scale differences. Generally, we find that the career prospects in Egypt for youth workers are poorer than in Tunisia, where they are poorer than in Jordan. So Jordan is relatively well off in the region compared to Tunisia and especially Egypt. And when we look at the different waves for Egypt, where we have year 2008, 2012, 2018, what we actually see is that the conditions have been deteriorating. So in 2008, if you youth workers in the 2000s had a higher probability of landing in decent job and progressing in their career than what we see in 2012 and in 2018. Okay, let me quickly wrap up. I'm sure I'm running out of time. So we do find that comparing youth and non-youth workers, we do find that youth workers have a harder time landing jobs overall and decent jobs in particular than older workers. We can see clear, definitely clear gender gaps, and these gender gaps are particularly large in Egypt, less so in Tunisia, less so in Jordan. In Egypt, actually, we see the usual thing we see is that higher education helps workers land in more decent jobs, but not so for women in Egypt. So higher education is associated with the workers' attempt to join labor force and get a job. But in this setting, in the MENA region or in Egypt specifically, we see that higher educated youth women simply end up being unemployed, searching for employment, rather than being actually employed or decently employed. So it just changes, it just results in a switch of women from being out of the labor force entirely to being unemployed, searching for jobs. Okay, we also find that it's not, we really shouldn't be talking about all youth workers or all youth men, all youth women, but we should talk about the different socioeconomic conditions that they start with. And there we see maybe even more worrying facts that the family conditions, wealth of the household, father's employment, or if there is no male adult in the household, the female-headed, having a female head of the household affects the employment prospects negatively for workers. And as I already said several times, including time indicators in these probabilistic regressions, we see clearly that over time, the labor market prospects have been going down. We see that for Egypt and for Jordan, where we have more than one waves of the panel survey. And finally, I will leave this slide. I think I summarized all the results and key findings. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Vladimir, I really appreciate your engagement to time. And of course, after your presentation, we get with the impression that there are dire conditions there in the 3 countries concerning youth condition when it comes to work, and especially the gender gap when it comes to having a stable job. I have here 2 reactions for you, Vladimir. One from Rodion. He says, I have a methodological question to Vladimir. You mentioned 4 categories of vulnerable youth. Quite interesting division, but sorry, it's moving here. Yes, but how did you succeed with the relevant data? Do the statistical offices have the data illustrating the situation with all these categories of youth? Yes, question about maybe data collection. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if I can quickly respond, well, we have detailed information about the employment conditions. Do workers have a contract? Are they covered by social insurance? Do they work within or outside of establishment? How large is the employer? Is it private sector, public sector, and so on? So we can do multiple cuts, and but the question was, what is most relevant for the region, and maybe kind of theoretically where we think the vulnerabilities are. And so, for example, there are things we did not look at hours of work, for example, or earnings or wages. We could do some of those cuts, but here is what we selected after a lot of consultation.
Yes, thank you. And Iwona Gankosh has a comment. She said, a very interesting finding mentioned by Vladimir: young people staying out of the labor market while expecting to get a quality employment. Our research also confirms that certain types of jobs do not help to transit to better employment, but rather lock people in more vulnerable stages and conditions. Yes, I think this is, you mentioned something similar. And Roger comes back again with another question. Do you observe rising the level of labor migration of vulnerable groups, example, well-educated women from Egypt, between mentioned countries, etc.?
On migration, I don't know if it's rising. We did a separate analysis of migration trends. I think this is beyond the scope of this webinar. But yes, there are we mostly looked at migration of men, where the situation is a little bit easier to discuss. Kind of most young men migrate for economic reasons, and there is no, let's say, family or cultural burden associated with the migration. So we know some trends on the migration of MENA region young males. I guess I will leave it at that.
Yes, Marek says only 18% of employees in 2012 remained employed, I think she wants to say employed in 2018. It seems surprisingly low. What can we be the reason for this? What can be the reason for this?
Yeah, that's me. Actually, I was talking about employers. There was a category.
Employers, oh, sorry.
Yes. So I was kind of surprised because, well, when it comes to Poland, for instance, when someone starts being an employer, is just a natural path of career. So if you become an employer, you remain an employer for a long time of your career in most cases. So what happens there, that only 18% of those who became employers remained employers 6 years later.
I don't know. A couple of responses here. The group of employers is rather small. So across these survey waves, we see some differences because of the small group size. I think also maybe it's worth thinking that this might be related to the migration trends, because what we see, a lot of return migrants come from abroad, from the Gulf, from other African countries, or from Europe with some assets. And the best way to get established in the MENA countries is to use these assets to establish a business, become employers. And so, the trends we see in being employers could be related to the conditions for migrating out and returning from abroad.
Yes, on behalf of everyone present here, I would like to thank Vladimir. We still have a couple of questions, but we don't want to make Mircea wait more. He has been very patient with us. Thank you very much, Mircea, who's going to talk about youth transition and in the ETF partner countries. And there will be a question about segmentation of needs, for example, challenges getting into the knowledge society. I'm sure it will be another interesting presentation today. Mircea, the floor is yours. You're welcome.
Today we will try, I say we because I'm working on this together with Christina on these transition issues. We will try to give you an overview of what we do in ETF from 3 points of view: the framing, the measurement, and the link to policies, because I think we believe the last point is really important in our work. You may remember what a famous poet said about 100 years ago, that youth is not a time of life, it's a state of mind. But that was 100 years ago, and it was poetry. If we go down today and we use call numbers like we statisticians try to do every time, we get a very different picture of the youth. And what we see is that in our partner countries, up to 40% of youth age 15 to 24 are NEETs. In 2 countries, Kosovo and Palestine, that's the figure. But then in most of the countries, it's at least 1/3, and in the Balkans, it's a bit lower, but it's at least 1/4 of the youth. And then 60% of them are mismatched. You heard before today that they got quite lousy jobs in the beginning of their career. And so it's the situation it's really complicated, and the numbers are not looking good at all. What we frame in our work is a complexity of issues. So we look at several issues. The time of youth unemployment rate has long gone today, because youth unemployment rate, as you probably know, it's only refers to 1/3 of the youth. Up to 70% of the youth are inactive, so they're not on the labor market. And then when I hear that 50% of youth are unemployed, I notice that must be a politician, because it's 50% of 30%. We statisticians are quite severe on that. So what we frame is that the context information, which came recently in the context of the pandemic, but there are also new transition patterns. The transition is longer, is much more complicated than before, much more complicated than during my times when it was study first, work later. People come and go to this transit to the labor market. Some of them don't transit at all. And we need a lot more information, much more detailed information on the labor market situation of youth, and also the long-term consequences of educational attainment on the labor market attachment. So this is how our measurement framework looks like. And we always start with a picture of where they are, because you cannot say that they are somewhere or here or there if you don't know exactly what they do. And that's a statistics which is available in the LFS, in the Labor Force Survey. It refers only to the Western Balkans, because I was not able to find data in other regions. And it shows you that 40% of the youths are still in school, okay, up until the age of 24 or 29. They are invisible for us. It's like in Harry Potter. They are under the invisibility clock. We don't see them because they're in school, obviously, and so they are inactive. And that's a part which we don't consider in our work. And what's on top of that it's the percentage which is in school at work. It's a proxy for work-based learning. My colleagues were very excited when they saw this figure. It's not only work-based learning, okay? It's those who are in school and work, come and go depending on the period of the survey. They are counted as this. Then you have the employment rate, which you all know, the youth employment rate. And in Europe, it's about 30%. So 1/3 of youth are employed in Europe as an average. And then there is the needs, and that red part is what interests us in our work in ETF. So we had to see how we can minimize that part. And the leverage is in the gray part, because you cannot have 80% of people in schools or 80% of people in employment, young people. It's not possible, and therefore the leverage is there. That gray part is 15% at the EU level, but it's 40%, even beyond 40%. It's 46% in Netherlands, it's 40% in Ireland, in Iceland, sorry. It's 1/3 in Denmark or Norway, and it's 1/4 in Austria and Germany. What these countries have in common is strong vet system. Okay, so you have a leverage there. You want to decrease the needs. Simply is that you have to work on the school and work part, the gray area, and that's actually the essence of the youth guarantee, which is the link to the policy part, and which tries to bring people either in school or in work, sorry, through the apprenticeships. In this youth guarantee, it is implemented in the Western Balkans, but it's present in other regions, obviously, not under the same brand. Youth guarantee, it's EU for Youth, for instance, in the East, and it's something else in the South, but it's here to stay, at least in our plans. So we will be working more and more increasingly with our partner countries on youth policies. It's based on the indicator frameworks, which I will show later on. And it has a kind of standard assessment, which is implemented at the EU level, which is called the Joint Assessment Framework. It's based on the fact that it's based on the employment, because it was implemented first on the employment targets. It has one indicator and then two subcategories. So it has the main indicator is needs age 15 to 29, and then you have two different sets of indicators. I'll come back later. Sorry, dealing with labor market situation, detailed labor market situation, and the impact of youth guarantee on the long-term outcomes on the labor market position of youth. This is the framework which was revised in 2021, and it has 10 indicators. Okay, so you have on the left-hand side the detailed information on the labor market situation of the youth, and on the right-hand side more about the long-term effects. On the left-hand side, you have more classical indicators like employment, unemployment, the youth unemployment ratio, because this counts a lot. It's much better to use it when you work on youth than the youth unemployment rate, because of the inactivity which I've mentioned. And it has let's say the main split of the needs. Everything matters in youth transition. So the 5 classical splits, age, sex, education, labor market, and program orientation or VET, all matters in it. And if you combine them, you'll never get the right picture, because, for instance, the needs goes up with the age, because it's the school that protects the people. Once they are out of the schools, they are no longer protected, and they go on the labor market and they become unemployed, for sure, or employed in low-skilled jobs. The gender matters, because you have different patterns there. The young man goes on the labor market, and they try to be unemployed, but they transit between different stages. Whereas the young woman, they choose to remain inactive, and inactivity is measured in terms of family responsibilities, in terms of looking after people with disabilities and things like that. So that's the gender. Education matters as well. Let's say the VET, the program orientation, matters as well, because what we know for VET is that at least 60% are employed, but then they don't continue their education in a very small proportion, up to 5%. So the rest are needs, obviously. And this is a kind of short overview of why it's important to look at these 5 breaks and this is what we do in ETF. It's a very data intensive process because with 5 splits, with 4 years, you will see later why 4 years, and with 10 indicators, you end up to something like 100 values for a country, okay, which is a lot. We don't usually get to manage these. On the right-hand side, on the contrary, you have the longer-term effects on the youth guarantee implementation, and there you have a combination of educational indicators, all from LFS. We don't use administrative data in education in the youth guarantee, in the youth transition. And the most important one, the one which gives you quite an interesting picture on the employability of youth, is one of the benchmarks, one which is actually called the employability benchmark, is the employment rate of recent graduates. And this is based on a concept which we designed about 10 years ago in the Joint Research Center together with my team. And it's the only benchmark, one of the few benchmarks that made it to 3 different monitoring frameworks. It's about people, young people, aged 20 to 34, who are no longer in education, so they are on the labor market, and who left the education 1 to 3 years ago. Okay, so they are on the labor market between 1 to 3 years ago. Why? Because the unemployment space transition patterns are very complicated. And when we estimated, we realized that 1 to 3 years, it gives us quite a stable picture. It is calculated by Eurostat and is available for all the countries. It's about 70% of the EU level, but it's about 90% in Germany, okay, but only 50% in Greece. So you have quite a wide gap between the EU countries. In our countries, it's between 60 and 70. How do we measure? Sorry, the transition. What has happened? The COVID has had impact the situation, the transition of youth in a very, very serious way. So what we noticed in the first year of the transition was a shift of 5 points in needs, 10 points in employment rate, and 15 points in unemployment rate. Okay, the signs, I'll let you guessing which are the signs of plus minus. Now, me as a statistician, I don't see every day shifts of 15 points. Okay, so and that's one country. So it was the impact was devastating, and so we had to look at the anchor. Okay, because when you do comparisons, you need to link it to something. So the best anchor from a statistical point of view was 2015, because before there were shifts due to harmonization, different levels. The ISCED level, ISCED has changed, for instance. So we saw there that the needs between 15 and 19, the needs rates, at least in the Balkans, where we had time series, were under control. So countries were managed to deal with this situation. Even in countries like Kosovo, for instance, we started with 40, but in 19 was about 30, 35 something. And all of the others from the Balkans were between 24 and 19, I think was in Serbia. But then the pandemic came, and as I told you, the effect was devastating. So in the first year of the pandemic, which was 2020, we had to do some damage control, and we need to use other metrics from using different indicators and to see what happened actually. So 15, 20, and now we move to post-pandemic period in which we say, okay, how do we measure? Because we need to do some justice to them, because between 15 and 19, they did well. So we're not going to compare 21 with 15. Okay, so what we do is to fix 20 to fix 15 as an anchor, look at 20, and then look at 21 plus. So what we notice now is that in 21, most of the Balkan countries have recovered. Obviously, the country with 5% increase in needs. Most of them have recovered. We cannot say if it's a trend, because the statistics is one value, one point in time, we cannot say it's a trend, but we believe it's a trend. So we have to look at 22, 23, 24 to be able to say, okay, they are back to 2019, when they were doing fine. What fine? Okay, well enough, but 20% is not that bad compared to 40. And then what comes into the picture, and this is the novelty, because on the Youth Guarantee Framework, we added the cherry on the cake, the mismatch, which is present everywhere. So today you need to confess in the presence of mismatch because it's sizable. It's so sizable that you cannot ignore it. Okay. So now the first thing I get when I show this slide is that I'm getting a comment saying the numbers don't get to 100, which I think is fine because it means that my audience is awake. They don't add to 100, obviously, because there are different metrics. So therefore, I decided to put a note down. The first two they do add, they are the needs, the overall needs, need rates. So the unemployed and inactive, as I said, the instrumental split for these guarantees, the labor status. So you had needs based on labor status, so either unemployed or employed. The second one is unemployment rate. I try to keep the colors from the previous graph. But the third one, the fourth one, the last one, this is a bit shocking because it shows you that half of the youth age 15 to 24 who worked are mismatched, meaning that they got jobs who no longer represent their studies because that's a skills mismatch. It's a kind of qualifications mismatch. It shows you how many of those with tertiary studies have semi-skilled jobs. Tertiary studies is ISCAT 5 to 8. Semi-skilled jobs is ISCO 4 to 8. Semi-skilled jobs, I don't know, reception, the call center, things like that. And there you have the image of the transition, you know, a kind of crude image of the youth transition, whereby we already know, but we didn't know that it's that high. Things like I graduated from university and then I work at McDonald's is a reality for half of the youth. Okay, so this was measured pre-COVID. So we're gonna re-estimate the mismatch with post-COVID data next year. So we'll see what's going on there. But it's quite shocking. Okay, because it shows you that if you are a young person today, even if you graduated from the university, you have a choice between being unemployed, stay at home with parents, or work at McDonald's or in a call center. So finally, I think I'm running out of time. Finally, what matters? So the first thing that matters is that not all needs are the same. Some are vulnerable, some are not. Okay, if you have, for instance, people that young people who don't look for a job, and it's 1 in 20 in Europe, but it's different by gender. It's 1 in 10 for women, but only 1 in 3 for men. They're not the same as the target group, and we are interested in target group which can be reskilled, which needs to be back on the labor market, and that's why we need to know who are they. Young women are more affected, as I said. The pandemic has changed the things a lot. Okay, we didn't know what kind of effect would have a pandemic because we never had a pandemic before. But in some countries was devastating. Okay, I'm not going to tell you the country. The time matters, as I said, because the transition is more prolonged, it's unstable, and it's less predictable than before. You don't have study first, work later, but you have do both if you can, because it will help you to live. Actually, any job can help you to live if you are a young person. And then it's atypical. The transition has become very atypical. There are more challenges, and very few young people transit to a matched job. And I think it was discussed so much in this today, then I'm not going to insist on it. And here I have the references. Few key messages. If you want to do monitoring, you need a clear framework. Okay, and the youth guarantee can be a start. It's very intensive, it's very heavy, you need a lot of data. But some data are particularly needed. So for instance, out of the 5 splits that I've mentioned, the labor status, so inactive unemployed, is crucial because you need to know what to do next. Okay. In the same framework, there are different use and meanings of the indicators, and obviously this makes also a difference. And then there are also new patterns of youth transition. As I said, the time matters, the mismatch matters a lot. And so you need a kind of interinstitutional cooperation. What we do today is that to give people some evidence. Okay, and this is what we've done in the past 10 years on the youth transition. As I said, youth transition is here to stay. We will do always more, never less in all the regions. And so we needed to kind of tell people how we work. And you have quite a list of publications. we managed to do 3 papers for each of our regions. One is still pending, but not for a lot of time. So the South would be available soon. And then you have the mismatch, and then you also have our standard tailor-made data collection, which is called KISA, and then some other statistics, some other references from our work. We work on youth transition together with ILO in the Balkans. So Christina and I, we are part of the monitoring there. We do the macroeconomic part, the framework which I showed you earlier, and the ILO does the direct monitoring, which is the working with PES. The link between them is that we can wait 2-3 years to see the patterns in the LFS, because if everything goes right in the PES, you see the results in the LFS, but not the next day, but in the couple of years. So I think there's a lot to be done. As I said, we will move on South and East in the coming years, and that's it. I'll stop here. I'll stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mircea. Very insightful. I have here some reflections of our colleagues who are connected with us. So Nasser Said says, I believe after Corona pandemic should be revised, especially when we come to the data collection methods. I mean, after Corona. And there is a ombudsman who said that for Vladimir, your presentation explains very well high graduate unemployment rates in the region because of young people accept to enter first into indecent jobs. Then they tend to be trapped in informal sectors. You mentioned young males in this situation. What about young females? Would you like to react to this, Vladimir?
I already sent a private message to Umuhan. But yeah, in my presentation here and even in the paper, we didn't focus as much on young women, perhaps by mistake, because of kind of I think the cultural setting in the region, where the expectations and the culture is that well, women will not remain in the labor market too long. They will transition out into marriage and so on. And we do a little bit of this analysis, but not as carefully as for the youth men.
Yes, thank you, Vladimir. Of course, there is also Francesca shares some reflection. She said it would be nice to compare findings. We ran some regressions in Egypt, Jordan, based in 2016 LFS data, and found high correlation between higher education and vet education and probability of being employed. I understand you had different findings. In any case, also tech activation role of education is noticeable in the region. And we have Michel, who said that the high percentage of combining work and school in the Netherlands is mainly caused by a small side job of students. This is thank you for the information, Michel. Yes, please, you can take the floor. You're raising your hand.
Thank you very much. Just to remind you that we still, normally we are ending the webinar now, but we still have another half an hour for those who are willing to spend their half an hour more with us to discuss further and even to see if there are different studies of similar nature focusing on the same topics, and if there is a room for further future collaboration on this topic. I think there could be also more discussion already on the presented papers. I don't know whether there are questions for Mircea as well, because I didn't see any on the chat. But just to remind you this, and then I come back to my question and comment to Vladimir's presentation. Well, it was very interesting, but it's a very good case, kind of illustration of the need for research, not only for labor market indicators, but also socioeconomic indicators of people. Because we can see, of course, high unemployment rate for graduates in the region, young males, for example, or young females, but without explaining their socioeconomic background, there are key aspects: age, gender, education level and type, as well as socioeconomic family background, basically, fathers and mothers, education and employment, basically. These are really the key explanations, because I remember doing research in the Mediterranean, South Mediterranean region 10 years ago, which I find more or less kind of 4 or 5 different youth groups based on their gender differences as well as socioeconomic differences. As you know, the region is famous for high graduate unemployment. To the point that someone told this voluntary unemployment, because these people who are university graduates, if they start a bad job in the first place, they will highly likely to be continuing in the bad jobs. But we should not forget that there are differences across the socioeconomic background, because first of all, most of these people coming from better families because they could access to higher education, right? But there are still some people who could access the higher education without good, well-off background families. And what we see indeed is that you are either someone who can refuse undecent jobs and wait because your family supports you, and this is definitely voluntary unemployment in a way. Of course, it is involuntary, but I mean, still you can refuse the job offer because it's too bad. While there are some other people who simply cannot afford to be unemployed because there is no family to support them, right? They have to enter the labor market immediately. And these are all men. We are not talking about women. As Vladimir mentioned, this is about males who are supposed to be breadwinners still. I think things do not change by few years in none of the societies. This is more or less the same. While on the woman case, if women come from high socioeconomic profile families, of course they can insist to work and they can find very good, well-protected jobs in the public sector or in the very good, high-profile big companies because of the support from the fathers or families. But majority of women, I mean, because they cannot get access to decent jobs, it's simply not even safe to work, lack of transportation, lack of lack of good working environment. I'm not even talking about sexual harassment and all these things. If you are working in a workplace as a young woman, there is always these risks. So my point here is that, well, this is also part of a conclusion. I think first we need to document the situation of young people and women as much as we can. So the research is still useful, even if nobody looks at it at some times. This is the first lesson. I think we should keep documenting the realities. But when we try to document the realities, we need to go beyond just unemployment rate or inactivity rate. We need to really go beyond these simple indicators and try to understand underlying reasons as we try to, bring some cases today here. And the third point, I think, despite all the research done, of course, there are also many other researchers done on the same countries, but these are not the first or the most important researchers. There are hundreds of researchers on every country we talk today about the same topics. What seems to be missing is how to translate or get the attention of public and politicians on these research findings. This is a never-ending problem, as you know. Also, the problem of researchers, you know, how we are to be heard. Sometimes even we have the politicians who prefer to look other way. But even if this is the case, I think we need to still attract the attention of public in the wider sense. I don't think that we should focus only on politicians, you know, government institutions to attract their attentions, especially if they are immune to this kind of research because it doesn't simply fit into their agenda. Because, you know, if there are problems of unemployment, they prefer that men get jobs first. Why they should, you know, concern about women? I mean, breadwinners are men, right? This is political, at least populist new understanding even now. But we can raise the attention in the larger society, you know, in the society, in other segments of society, civil society, private sector, because there are always some people who are more sensitive to these messages. So I think researchers need to use more the social media, the media in broad sense, so disseminating the research findings in the newspapers, in the media, in the social media, whatever the platform is. I think this is something we can all do, at least something in our country context. And I stop here as conclusive remarks. I would like to thank you again to all the speakers, chairpersons, moderators of this webinar. For those who want to stay longer, please feel free to take the floor. I will give you I think it was me or who is the moderator of the free session?
Bakit, because unfortunately the scientific coordinator of the network, Terence Ugarty, is not available today. And so Bakit will chair, let's say, the last 15 minutes. So it's going to be, let's say, an informal session where people can exchange views about the research topics or what could be.
I stop here.
Yeah.
And thank you for your participation. Extremely good level of participation for everybody. I stop here. Back to Bakit.
Thank you very much, Ümmühan. I think you have clearly indicated all important aspects of today's gathering. So please, colleagues, if anyone wants to volunteer to share your experience or insights, you can use this option of raising hands or just through the chat box. So please feel free to join us for this informal networking discussions. Thank you.
If I may, maybe I can say it would be very nice to hear from, you know, other organizational researchers whether you have some work ongoing or planned on the topic that we are discussing today, or because we also didn't have that much time for exchange, if you have comments or reflections. I think that the presentations from our colleagues from ETF and from Vladimir were extremely interesting and a lot to digest. And, you know, when they were talking, I had myself a lot of, you know, question marks and ideas also for things that we haven't been doing. I mean, there is always a bit of a limitation on resources and time. And while colleagues were talking, I was thinking, why didn't we, you know, investigate more on these or that other aspect? There is always choice to be made. So if you have reflections, please share them with us. It's really an informal discussion we want to open in this last part of the meeting.
Well, just to add that you can also share ideas for future collaboration. You know, if you have a special interest on these topics to do further research. Oh, well, okay, I stop here. I saw Vladimir raising.
Yes, so I just wanted to quickly respond to some of the remarks that Umhan made. These were very nice conclusions, very broad, and for me, kind of three things that came to me is in our work, we cut up the employment statuses in a certain way, and kind of, I guess, underlying idea was to get at the issue of kind of underemployment, and so that's, I think, one area where more work can be done for us in the MENA region and in other world regions of whether that's contract, social insurance, hours worked, seasonal. I think how to cut out exactly the employment conditions that are somehow disadvantaged and vulnerable. Another comment, another interesting observation that Umhan made was about the kind of advantaged groups versus disadvantaged groups, and that maybe politicians don't care about the employment status of youth workers. So I think that's also very important point, that I think there are these enfranchised groups, let's say maybe the children of high social classes, and they start in the labor market with successful positions, and they have their trajectory in front of them, and maybe that's what the political leaders see, and they don't see the employment status and the transitions of the disenfranchised groups. And the third thought, Umhan also talked, and I talked a little bit about the role of education. And actually, I think, and one thought here is that actually if we just look at very simple data, binary and kind of like quantitative values of how much education people have, we miss the very important point of quality of education. In the Arab region, actually the educational achievements are high and going up, especially among women. Women are catching up or even outdoing men. But why are they not employed? And well, I think part of it is that maybe it doesn't take family resources to send women to school. You send them to bad quality public schools, and it doesn't do them any good in the labor market. So that's another kind of I think here's kind of a warning that just a raw data can be even misleading, because they don't have the kind of the sense of what education means in terms of labor market skills for youth workers, how to compare education versus work experience, and the value of work experience in irregular, informal, and formal jobs. Those could be very different. Those could mean very different things for a later career progress.
If I can step in with a small reflection and maybe a proposal for next topics. Yeah, I think this is an important element of measuring transition from school to work, but also measuring mismatch, because when we assess mismatch, we look at LFS data, we calculate vertical, horizontal, but this element of diploma versus skills remains there. And maybe LFS or this kind of more traditional sources is not the best one. Yeah. So I know that, for example, Marek is working a lot on transition, on tracer studies or graduates, elements, combining administrative data, other type of sources, and the classical ones coming from survey. So I think in this context, this could be an idea to explore later this year to see how we can, shed light on these issues, because I confirm, Vladimir, this is also an issue in the Western Balkans, where there was a huge high increase in Turkey as well in tertiary graduates, in 10 years, doubling the numbers of people who possess higher education, diplomas. And there we notice the highest level of mismatch. And it's not only about absorption issues on the labor market, I don't know, creation of higher level jobs and whatever. It's also a matter of quality and the content of the skills that are acquired during university. Thank you.
Marek is raising his hand.
Yeah, so if I may, as I've been called out, so when it comes to mismatch, I totally agree that's an important issue. The problem is that the measurement of it might be quite problematic, especially that there are some countries, including Poland, when there is when we talk about mismatch. Let's start with vertical one. The job position doesn't have stated clearly out what are the requirements for that. So if we take, an expert look on a single case, that shouldn't be a problem. The thing is, if we want to do it for the entire population, then that leads us to lots of decision to be made. And the problem is that there is barely any information on that in the data sets that are available in the administrative data, because, well, when there is a job position, we cannot figure out, there is no variable saying what is the education level required. I know that there are states where such data exist, but it's not the case in Poland, especially that there are some very well-paid jobs, including in IT mostly, where the degree that you have is not really an issue. As long as you know what you're doing, as you can do your programming, nobody really cares about your diploma. Your fact, getting a diploma is just one way of proving your programming skills. But if you can show it in any other way, while, for instance, being able to do the task they expect you to do, or presenting a certificate for getting an SQL online course, the most common standardized one, it might be enough, because, well, you just proven you know your SQL. So it's not necessarily that, well, it is when it comes to vertical data, it might not be that easy. When it comes to horizontal one, we address yet another issue, and one of the questions that I tend to ask when this topic appears is, and when does a philosopher work according to their education when it comes to horizontal one? I mean, when it comes to a higher education level, there are some majors that, well, it works, so we can say whether a person works according to their education or not, like when it comes to police officer schools, or fire workers, higher educational schools, or when it comes to doctors or nurses. It makes sense for some, for those, but I'm afraid that closes the list, because when it comes to a higher education, it's mostly not about getting a person prepared to do a particular job, but providing them with more variety of skills, so they are able to start a job in numerous ways in different environments. And like, for instance, when we made some interviews with employers at our university, or the University of Warsaw, so one of the big employers interested in our graduates said that, well, one of his favorite majors are the graduates from Polish Culture Institute from our university. And we are kind kind of surprised because it had nothing to do with what the company did. And the question was, why do you like those graduates so much? It has nothing to do with this. And he said, well, I just know it's a difficult major. If someone was able to get through the courses at the Polish Culture Institute, they're smart and they are able to, and I will be able to teach them what they need to do at the workplace. So the thing is, when it comes to a horizontal mismatch, it gets, I guess, even more problematic. There are some indicators that might, so there are other indicators that we prefer. So it's not like, can you find a job that suits your education? It's more like, can you get a decent job? I mean, is your job stable? Do you stay there? Do they pay you well? And that might be another indicator of success, because, well, if someone, I don't know, graduated from history, let's say, doesn't necessarily, a success on the labor market does not necessarily mean working as a historian, but it might be just, you know, finding your proper place in the labor market. And if I'm already with the mic, I would like to ask a question to Vladimir, if I may. So I didn't quite catch up the sources of your data. Are they surveys or register based? If I understood correctly, they're survey based. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
It's all from the labor market panel surveys,
okay,
which are publicly available from regional research organization, ERF, Economic Research Forum in Cairo. And when you register, you can apply to get access to these surveys. These are slightly different from labor force surveys and or household expenditure surveys and other surveys. So the key thing is that they are relatively large and they're panel.
Sure, that's always the thing.
Thank you, colleague. Thank you. We are. You have one more question, Marek?
Yes. So, do you happen to know the response rate on that survey panel? What more or less can it be?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
What is the response rate of the panel survey? Do you happen to know that?
I don't know it off the top of my head. I think kind of high. It's not like a phone survey. It was very carefully. It was a very expensive exercise with I think European Union being a partner, and with some caveats that I think the let's say Egypt and Jordan are much larger, much more carefully done, and I think there are some concerns with some things in let's say with the Tunisian data.
Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you so much.
I saw earlier that Oti was raising her hand. Oti, if you still want to ask something or comment something, please.
Yes, just put my hand down because I thought there wouldn't be time, but if there is a minute, I just wanted to react to what Vladimir was saying about the families investing in quality education of women, girls and women, whether they want and can afford it. Just to confuse the picture even more, now when we look at the sort of very egalitarian societies like the Nordic countries, where education of women and men, girls and boys is very much to the same level and same also of good quality, we still see a higher gender pay gap than in the countries which are less egalitarian in terms of access and quality of education and investment in women's education. And we see also that in very difficult to enter sectors like the tech industry, where even the high skilled women who enter in those sectors, the pay gap is even larger than in the other sectors. So the quality education, I think it's obviously a need, a necessity, but it still doesn't explain us why the career progression of women then still cannot reach the same level of men. And that's why we need the indicators that go beyond the classical indicators of quality of education and labor markets. And that's why also I think that the education and training systems do have the role and the responsibility also to tackle through what they transmit as norms and stereotypes and knowledge to transform the biases that we have in society.
Thank you, Jay. Yes, Vladimir, just to quickly intervene with you, and we are just want to remind you that we are closing very soon, finishing, wrapping up.
So just in a few
thank you.
Just one thought from my end was in response to Uti was that, well, education is not just an input into skills useful for labor market, but it's also for marriage market. And so some family investment into education might be not for jobs, but for marriage. I say it because before my current appointment, I worked at a female-only largest global female-only university in the world, in Ewha Women's University in Korea, where several graduates became the first ladies of Korea. And in some sense, it's a university not, I don't want to say things too bluntly, but it's education for labor market, but it's also education to get social status and do well on the marriage market.
Thank you, Vladimir. Francesco, Giancarlo, would you like to give some concluding remarks? Or
Francesca, maybe, I mean, from my side, thanks a lot for joining a very interesting webinar. We will share, let's say, as we mentioned in the chat box, all the links to the publications presented today are in the invitation, but in any case, we'll make everything available after this, after the closing of the webinar, as well as the recording of the webinar, so that people who were not able to attend the webinar today can, in any case, listen to our discussion and know more about what we have just talked about. Francesca.
Thank you, Giancarlo, and thanks to all. I echo my colleague in really thanking you for your participation. Very insightful discussion and reflection. There were also some ideas in the chat for possible lines of research, which I very much agree with. And let me remind you that ETF has launched a call for innovative research proposals. The call is open still for like 1 more week. So if you are interested, please reach out to us, and we would be very happy to receive your proposal. Very interesting to see that there are similarities not only across countries, but across continents. What you, Vladimir, were mentioning about South Korea, it's a very well-known feature from some countries, especially in the Mediterranean, but it's obviously not something which links only to those countries, but goes well beyond. So I think that really there were very interesting input. I want to thank all of the speakers and of course my colleagues from ETF for having organized this webinar. There will be another webinar at the beginning of April. The next topic, which was chosen actually by the members of the network, will be about the use of big data for labor market information and the link to the green skills needs emerging in the countries. So I wish you all a very nice lunch break, and thanks again for discussing with us. And of course we are here, so for any interest to follow up on the discussion, feel free to reach us and write to us. We'll be happy to discuss more. Thank you and see you soon.